What if I told you the greatest conqueror in history wasn't born in triumph, but in thunder, fire, and fear? The night he was born, lightning tore through the sky. A temple burned, and in the ashes, a whisper began, the whisper of a name that would echo for eternity. Alexander. The year was 356 BCE. A storm howled over the ancient city of Pella. Thunder cracked the heavens, and lightning danced across the night sky. In that same moment, a child opened his eyes for the first time. They say the Temple of Artemis, one of the great wonders of the world, caught fire that night. A coincidence, perhaps, or a sign, because this wasn't just any child. This was Alexander. He wasn't born into peace. He was born into tension, into prophecy and power plays. His father, King Philip II, was no ordinary ruler. A warrior king, a tactician who had dragged Macedonia from the shadows and forged it into a rising force. To Philip, power wasn't inherited, it was seized. By fire, by steel, by strategy. And from the very beginning, Alexander was taught that same truth. But then there was Olympias, his mother. She didn't speak of war. She whispered something far more dangerous into his young ears. You are not the son of a man. You are the son of Zeus. From that moment on, Alexander didn't just believe he could be great. He believed he was destined to be more than mortal, divine, chosen. While other children played in fields, Alexander obsessed over Achilles, over myths and monsters, over glory and wrath. But myth alone wasn't enough. To shape a legend, you need a mind that can hold a world. So Philip summoned the greatest thinker of their time, Aristotle. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander didn't just study philosophy. He inhaled it. Ethics, medicine, politics, poetry, even the stars above. Where others saw books, he saw blueprints for empire. But knowledge didn't tame him. It only sharpened the edge. My father will leave me nothing to conquer, he once said. Even as a boy, Alexander wasn't satisfied with limits. Borders, obstacles, fear. They weren't walls to him. They were invitations. One day, they brought out a beast no man could ride. A wild, black stallion with fire in its eyes. Bucephalus. Warriors tried. Trainers failed. The creature thrashed, kicked, snapped its teeth like a demon unleashed. Everyone gave up, except Alexander. He didn't charge the horse. He watched it, silently, carefully. Then he did something no one expected. He walked up and turned Bucephalus toward the sun, because he saw what no one else did. The stallion wasn't mad. It was afraid of its own shadow. By turning it away, Alexander removed the fear. He climbed on its back and rode. Silence fell. Even King Philip was stunned. He didn't say, "Well done." He looked at his son and said, "Macedonia is too small for you. Seek a kingdom worthy of your greatness." But not everyone cheered. Behind the praise, the palace seethed. Jealous nobles, half-brothers with daggers behind smiles, a stepmother with her own bloodline to protect, and a court where poison flowed more freely than wine. Even his parents, Philip and Olympias, weren't allies. Their marriage was fractured, their ambitions divided, and Alexander, caught in the middle of it all. Tensions built, and then they exploded. At a royal wedding, before the entire court, Alexander and Philip clashed. Words were sharp, so were the stares. The rift between father and son split open in front of kings and generals. And then the unthinkable. During the ceremony, with the eyes of the kingdom watching, King Philip II was assassinated, stabbed by his own bodyguard. Panic gripped the court. Whispers turned into storms. Was it political revenge? A family betrayal? Some even said Olympias had guided the blade. But while others froze, Alexander moved. He was just 20 years old, but with fire in his eyes and an army at his back. He seized the throne, and in a matter of days, the boy became king. He wasn't crowned in gold. He was crowned in blood. The young king had no time to mourn, no room for doubt. Enemies circled like vultures, some within his own palace. Rivals plotted. Half-brothers vanished. Generals watched in silence. But Alexander didn't flinch. He eliminated threats, secured the loyalty of his father's battle-hardened army, and let the world know A new storm had risen, but the throne was just the beginning. Across Greece, rebellion stirred. Sparta sneered. Athens hesitated. And Thebes, proud, legendary Thebes, resisted. They saw a boy, a child king playing dress-up in his father's armor. They expected delay, diplomacy, weakness. What they got was war. Alexander didn't send letters. He sent legions. In a flash of steel and thunder, he swept south. City after city bent the knee, not from love, but fear. Then came Thebes, defiant, arrogant, ready to fight. Alexander gave them one chance. They refused. So he made them example. In just days, Thebes fell. Not to famine, not to siege, but to fury. The walls were torn down. The city burned. Thousands killed. Survivors enslaved. Where once stood resistance, now stood ashes. And the message rang clear, across every hill, every harbor, every marble column of Greece. This is not a prince to test. This is a king to follow. Even Athens, heart of rebellion and reason, bowed. But Alexander didn't just want submission. He wanted unity, on his terms. He summoned the leaders of every Greek city-state to Corinth. Not to ask, to declare. He formed the League of Corinth, not a council, not a compromise. A command. He was now not only king of Macedonia. He was strategos autocrator, supreme commander of all Greece. And that, too, was only the beginning. Because Alexander's eyes weren't fixed on the lands he ruled. They were fixed east, on the richest, strongest, and most ancient empire the world had ever known, Persia. He didn't wait to be tested. He crossed the line literally. In 334 BCE, Alexander stepped onto Asian soil for the first time, not as an invader, but as a man claiming what he believed was already his by destiny and by blood. His army? Just over 30,000 men, veterans, loyal, hardened. They didn't march, they moved like wolves. Waiting for him across the Granicus River stood a wall of Persian steel. Cavalry, archers, mercenaries. They held the high ground. They had the numbers. They were certain no sane man would attack. But Alexander wasn't sane. He was something else. At sunset, his generals begged caution. The river was swollen. The banks were steep. A perfect trap. Alexander heard them and charged anyway. Not from behind. Not from safety. From the front, spear raised, eyes locked on chaos. The river erupted. Steel clashed. Horses drowned. The current ran red with blood. And in the middle of it all, Alexander, rallying, striking, commanding like a god of war carved from lightning and will. At one point, a Persian blade shattered his helmet. Another sliced into his skull. A fraction of a second more, and history would have ended right there. But one of his men leapt forward, blocked the final blow, and saved the world's future. By nightfall, the impossible had happened. The river belonged to Alexander. The Battle of Granicus wasn't just a victory. It was a declaration. I am not here to negotiate. I am here to conquer. His genius wasn't in brute force. It was in control. His phalanxes moved like machines. His cavalry struck like thunder. Every decision calculated. Every risk owned. To his enemies, he was chaos. To his men, he was immortal. And to the Persians, he was no longer just a threat. He was the beginning of the end. After Granicus, the path was open. City after city fell before him. But Alexander didn't slow down. He sped up, like a storm chasing lightning. Because he wasn't just after land. He was after a king. In 333 BCE, the King of Kings himself appeared. Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire. His army stretched from horizon to horizon. Cavalry, chariots, archers, over 100,000 men, ready to crush this Macedonian upstart. Alexander had less than half that number, but he had something far more dangerous than numbers. He had intent. The battlefield was set, near a narrow valley called Issus, a place where Darius's massive army couldn't stretch its wings, where numbers meant nothing and strategy meant everything. Darius expected a massacre. He was right, just not in the way he imagined. At dawn, Alexander didn't hesitate. He didn't defend. He attacked, straight at the heart. His phalanx split the Persian front like a knife through silk. His companion cavalry carved through the flanks like wildfire. Then, through the chaos, Darius saw something terrifying. Alexander, charging directly at him. The king of Persia panicked. He turned. He ran. He abandoned his soldiers, abandoned his honor, abandoned his family. In that moment, the myth of Persian invincibility shattered. But Alexander didn't chase Darius. He walked into the royal tents and found the king's treasures, gold, silks, jewels beyond imagination. And then he found Darius's family, his wife, his daughters, his mother. They expected death, slavery, shame. Instead, Alexander bowed. He ordered they be treated with dignity. No harm, no humiliation. To the world, it was mercy. To Alexander, it was strategy. Conquer with respect, he believed. Rule with reverence. He wasn't just taking cities. He was taking loyalty, taking hearts. And from that moment on, he wasn't just feared. He was admired. Persia trembled. But Alexander didn't stop. He turned south, toward a land older than myth. A land of pyramids, gods, and buried secrets. Egypt. For centuries, it had suffered under Persian rule. But when Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, the gates didn't shut. They opened. No battle. No resistance. The Egyptians didn't see a conqueror. They saw a liberator. They welcomed him with open arms. Not out of fear, but hope. And Alexander understood something few conquerors ever do. To rule the world, you must be wanted by it. He didn't tower above them. He walked among them. He wore Egyptian robes, honored their gods, offered sacrifice to Apis, the sacred bull. He didn't erase their culture. He embraced it. But for Alexander, unity wasn't enough. He wanted divinity. So he crossed the brutal expanse of the Great Sand Sea, a desert so vast, so merciless, it swallowed armies whole. His destination? A place whispered about in legend, the Oracle of Siwa, a temple hidden in the dunes, a place where God spoke and mortals listened. What happened inside, no one truly knows, not even his closest companions. But when Alexander emerged, his eyes were different. The priests had called him son of Zeus. Not as a title, as a truth. And Alexander didn't deny it. He claimed it. From that moment forward, he was no longer just a king. He was something more. Divine, destined, unstoppable. He would leave his mark, not just in war, but in stone. On the banks of the Nile, he founded a city, not in Greece, but in a land that had embraced him. He called it Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities in history, a beacon of knowledge, power, and culture. But for Alexander, it was more than a city. It was a statement. My empire isn't just swords and soldiers. It's civilization itself. He had conquered the battlefield. Now, he was learning to conquer time. It all came down to this. 331 BC. The final clash. 2 worlds. 2 kings. Alexander of Macedon. A storm wrapped in armor. Darius III. The last shadow of a dying empire. They met on the wide, open plains of Gaugamela, a battlefield prepared by the Persians to showcase their might. Darius cleared the ground for chariots, brought 200,000 men, cavalry, archers, infantry, war elephants. His forces stretched beyond the horizon. Alexander had just 47,000. He was outnumbered, outflanked, surrounded, and yet he was smiling, because Darius had prepared for a war of numbers. But Alexander? He had prepared for a war of minds. At dawn, dust swirled across the plain. The ground trembled. Alexander didn't charge. He shifted, angled his army diagonally, pulling Darius's cavalry off balance. The Persians took the bait. As they lunged to surround him, their lines fractured. That's when Alexander struck. His companion cavalry, sharp as a lightning bolt, sliced through the gap, straight toward Darius. Not to win the battle, to end the war. Darius watched the Macedonian charge tear through his guards. And once again, he ran, left his gold, left his honor, left his empire. The Persians broke. The battlefield collapsed into chaos. Tens of thousands fell. Alexander didn't linger in blood. He marched forward, into the heart of the empire, Babylon, Susa, and then Persepolis, the crown jewel of Persia. He entered its golden halls, sat on Darius's throne, stared into its ancient flames. Some say he burned the city in revenge for Persia's past crimes. Others say he watched the empire crumble, and knew no mortal should sit on a god's throne for too long. But one truth remains. That night, the fires rose, and Persia fell. An empire that had ruled for centuries was now ashes at Alexander's feet. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was the king of kings. Victory came fast, but control, that was a different war. Alexander stood at the height of power. Persia was his. The East had opened its gates. But one question loomed. Could one man rule the world? It wasn't just borders. It was beliefs, cultures, languages. The Greeks saw Persians as barbarians. The Persians saw Alexander as an outsider. Both were right, and both were wrong. But Alexander didn't choose sides. He chose fusion. He wore Persian robes, held court like a great king, brought Persian nobles into his administration. To many of his own men, it felt like betrayal. But to Alexander, it was the future. He wasn't just building an empire. He was building a world. So he did the unthinkable. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, not for politics, but for unity. Then, in a single, stunning ceremony in Susa, he ordered thousands of his Macedonian officers to marry Persian women. A marriage not just of people, but of civilizations. But the price of vision is isolation. His men grumbled. His generals whispered. They had followed him through fire and death, and now they barely recognized the man at the top of the world. He wasn't the boy from Pella anymore. He prayed in foreign temples, spoke in foreign tongues, ruled over strangers, but still he held it together. Through charisma, through policy, through sheer will. Because Alexander wasn't chasing power. He was chasing something no king had ever dreamed of. A unified earth, stitched together by courage, culture, and conquest. But even he knew, peace wouldn't get him there. If the world was to be united, it would have to be dragged into the light. And the next place he would drag it was India. He had conquered the greatest empire on earth. But now, he marched into a land that even legends feared. India. It wasn't just another campaign. It was a descent into the unknown. The terrain turned against them. Monsoons flooded roads into rivers. Jungles swallowed paths. Mountains loomed like giants watching from the sky. The air itself, dense, alien, alive with the cries of creatures unseen. But Alexander? He didn't pause. The edge of the map, he once said, is where the gods dare you to keep going. And he did. In 326 BCE, near the Hydaspes River, he met a king unlike any before. Porus, a giant in stature and spirit, commanding an army of men, archers, and something far more terrifying. War elephants. Massive, armored beasts trained to trample and terrify. To Alexander's men, they were monsters from myth. The battle began not with swords, but with rain. Alexander waited, watched. Then, under the cloak of storm and night, he crossed the swollen river, outflanking Porus in the dark. When dawn broke, Porus turned and saw it. Alexander's army, on the far side. Unexpected, unshaken, unreal. What followed was a clash of titans. Elephants charged. Cavalry met thunder. Mud turned to blood. But Alexander, injured, soaked, and relentless, refused to break. And neither did Porus. He fought like a lion, refused surrender, even as defeat closed in. Finally, surrounded and bloodied, he was captured. Alexander approached and asked, "How should I treat you?" Porus answered, "Like a king." Alexander smiled. "Then that is how you shall be treated." He didn't imprison him. He didn't shame him. He returned his kingdom, even expanded it, not out of mercy, but because Alexander understood a greater truth. Respect wins where swords cannot. But not everyone saw it that way. His army, soaked, starved, and scarred, finally said, "Enough." They had marched over 17,000 miles, fought countless battles, buried too many brothers. For the first time in his life, Alexander yielded. Alexander agreed to turn back. But the retreat was no victory. It was a funeral march. He didn't take the easy way home. He chose a path through hell itself, the Gedrosian desert, endless sand, blistering heat, no food, no water. The same man who had crushed empires now led his men into the jaws of nature. And this time, there was no enemy to fight, no kingdom to conquer, just survival. Thousands perished under the burning sun. Men who had fought elephants, crossed rivers, climbed mountains, now fell to wind and thirst. They didn't march. They crawled. And Alexander? He suffered with them, walked with them, watched them die. When they finally reached Babylon, there was no celebration, just silence. And then, Alexander lost the one thing he could never replace. Hephaestion, his closest companion, his mirror, his soul. The boy who had stood beside him when the world was still a dream was now gone. Alexander stopped eating, stopped speaking. He shaved his head in mourning, ordered temples across the empire to honor Hephaestion as a demigod. He had conquered Persia, crushed India, burned cities, raised nations. But this shattered him. He began to wither. Fever took him. Whispers filled the palace, poison, curses, divine punishment. And then, in 323 BCE, in the heart of Babylon, just weeks before launching a final campaign to Arabia, Alexander the Great lay still. His generals gathered. They asked, "Who will inherit your empire?" He didn't name a man. He whispered, "To the strongest." And with that, at just 32 years old, the greatest military mind in history fell into silence. No enemy's sword, no final battle, just the end. When Alexander died in Babylon, the world froze. His empire stretched from Greece to India, but there was no heir, no son ready, no general strong enough to hold it all. Just a whisper, "To the strongest." And with that, the empire fractured. His most loyal commanders, the Diadochi, or successors, once brothers in arms, now turned into rivals soaked in ambition. Macedonia, Egypt, Persia, India, all torn apart, claimed by men who wore crowns, but none who carried Alexander's fire. War erupted. Alliances crumbled. The world he had united descended into chaos. But even as his empire collapsed, his legend refused to die. Cities he founded, Alexandria, most of all, became centers of knowledge, science, and power. Greek language, art, philosophy, and astronomy spread across continents. Echoes of his vision. Temples were built in his name. Stories turned into myths. Some called him a god, others a curse. In the East, he was remembered as a bridge between worlds. In the West, as a model of kingship. Caesar wept at his statue. Napoleon studied his every move. Leaders, poets, dreamers, all chasing the shadow of a man who burned too bright and too fast. He died young. He died with no empire, but he died unforgettable. Alexander the Great, the boy who whispered to gods, the king who walked through fire, the man who bent the world to his will. He conquered more than land. He conquered imagination. Even now, centuries later, the name Alexander still echoes, not because he lived long, but because he lived loud, because in 32 short years, he lived 1,000 lifetimes. And maybe that's what greatness really is. Not immortality, but impact. Not time, but fire. There is nothing impossible to him who will try. Alexander the Great.